Over on Substack, the Unsolicited Advice Reading Group are reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. If you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. Right, Matt Whiteley, welcome to Solicited Advice.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much for being here. A Christian apologetic argument that has come to the fore in recent years is that the West owes everything or lots of things or almost everything to Christianity and its Christian history. And in fact, that Europe and America and our current value systems are inseparable from our Christian past. This has kind of been known broadly as the Tom Holland argument. And Tom Holland has entered a long line of thinkers throughout history who have given their names to arguments they didn't quite give. You've written pretty extensively on this. What is the Tom Holland argument, and what exactly does it say? What are its variants out in the intellectual ether?
Well, the Tom Holland argument is basically the argument that a lot more than we give credit for, perhaps basically everything about our society is dependent on Christianity, that all of our values, our cultural values, our political assumptions, our moral values are bred of, he uses terms like a Christian matrix, or like the bread of the marrow of Christianity. And so, like, if we're goldfish, the water that we're swimming in is Christianity. And so he is quite radical about it. He argues that basically things we would think are not Christian at all are Christian. So like gay rights, forms of atheism, basically everything is in some form related to the underlying kind of values of Christianity. And we're all just Christians whether we like it or not. There's no way around it. It's kind of had quite a life outside of Tom Holland in that it's kind of been taken by some Christian apologists have taken it and said, everything is Christian, therefore, for some reason, you need to be a Christian. It's also had quite a life in the sort of political sphere where it's kind of been like everything good about our society is Christian and we're losing it. So therefore, we need to, become Christian again to save our societies. And it's almost become a bit of a meme now. People just reference Tom Holland when they're talking about the decline of society. And it's, why we need Christianity back, and you need to read Dominion because it'll tell you. And I think, like you said, it's not really the argument that Tom Holland made exactly, because his argument is it's all Christian. Like, it's not like there's a bunch of good stuff and we're losing it. It's like even the stuff that Christians don't like is bred of Christian ideas. So like something like gay rights and the category of homosexuality, all this kind of stuff comes out of Christian categories and assumptions and Christian values, and you sort of can't get around it. So like, it's all a bit contradictory at large, but yeah, that's what it is.
Yes, and how is this, because I say Tom Holland gives a much broader sweeping thesis about the indebtedness of even kind of what we think of as opposing sides in certain cultural debates or certain political debates to, I think he talks about them as both sort of strains of Christian ethics. Now, I think it'd be interesting to draw a distinction between that thesis, which I think is sort of has a much broader definition of Christianity, and the more kind of apologetic thesis given that, in some sense, that attempts to isolate certain positive elements of modern values or modern ethics, things that we would currently endorse, and attribute those specifically to Christianity. How do these two arguments sort of function differently?
Well, it's hard to say, because some apologists are directly using Tom Holland's arguments. So it's slightly, there's somebody called Glenn Scrivener. I think you might have.
Oh, yeah. No, I know Glenn.
Yeah. He wrote a book called The Air We Breathe, and it almost directly sort of riffs off of Dominion and says, look, the trajectory of the West is all Christian. And so you kind of, in order to have the true source of all of these values, you need to go back to Christianity. But Tom Holland's argument is kind of that it's not like there's this single essential source of kind of like positive Christian values. It's like you can almost think of Christianity as this kind of ongoing, continuously reforming kind of phenomenon, such that the modern world itself is kind of like a reformation within Christianity, because sort of reformation is the fundamental characteristic of Christianity. So you have the Reformation, You have things like the Enlightenment, which he would say is Christian. And then you have kind of like rights movements in the 20th century, which again, he would say this kind of comes out of Christianity. The apologetics argument, I'd say, is a little bit more confused because it's ambiguous how you get from that to therefore it's true. Because Tom Holland's arguments are quite radically deterministic in the sense that what he's doing is he's saying, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, or if you were born in China, these values would mean nothing to you. That it's not just like this good thing gives you some good values. It's that the contingent history of Christianity gives you the judgments by which you judge those values as good. Which is why, even as a pragmatic argument, it's quite difficult to make, because if you want to make a pragmatic argument, you need some categories of judgment. And what Tom Holland is saying is that the categories of judgment come from Christianity. So, like, the argument would be circular. There's no way around it. Like, you just. And so Tom Holland himself, I think, says, well, I call myself a Christian because I can't avoid it. Like, I just am Christian in terms of my assumptions. But that I don't think he really believes in God in any sort of metaphysical sense. So, how exactly the apologists do this, I think, is a bit of a muddle, and I don't really agree with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about your writing is that you yourself are a Christian. It's no plenty of atheists and agnostics have questioned this kind of broad Tom Holland-esque series of arguments. But I think what's interesting about the way that you approach it is that a lot of your writing on the topic is, specifically coming at this from a Christian perspective and saying this isn't a persuasive or sound way to argue for the truth of the Christian faith. First of all, was this a kind of immediate reaction for you? Was this something that you kind of first had when reading arguments of this type? And secondly, in what way do you think this doesn't quite sort of do what apologists would like it to do?
Well, I mean, I think when I first read it, I kind of, when I read Dominion, I think it was when it came out, it was 2019, I think, I kind of felt like it was reasonable. I think it has annoyed me over the years as apologists have sort of taken it over. I think what's interesting about Tom Holland's arguments is that people tend to react to it quite instinctively as if it validates Christianity as true and good. And so people who are more inclined to be atheists feel like they have to disagree with it. And people who are Christians are like, oh yeah, he's on our team. And whereas I've come to see that it's sort of not really that at all, that you could take it as an argument against Christianity, because you could say, well, what he's demonstrating is a massive historical postcode lottery. That if you were born in, like I said, if you're born somewhere else, this would make no sense to you. And you kind of, the interesting thing is because Glenn Scrivener does this as well, is that you have to establish the argument by framing it against the idea that nothing outside of the Christian world makes any sense to Christianity, that like it's totally alien. So it's often framed against the Roman world, which I think perhaps is quite right in terms of demonstrating the uniqueness of Christianity's origin. But what they do is then they kind of project that as a kind of like something that must be true throughout all of history, that basically it's either Christianity or the Roman world, that it's either like power and dominance and brutality, or else it's the idea that the oppressed have value, and that you choose one of these, either you're a Christian or it's everything else. And like if you look at evolution, you don't see any morals of that nature. If you look at other societies, you don't see any morals of that nature. So therefore, the refrain is, where does it come from? Where does feminism come from? Because it's about equality. And it's not like the Roman world wouldn't care about that. So where does it go? It must be Christianity. And it just strikes me as, first of all, for Christians, you sort of have to deny that there's any universals there. That like part of an argument for Christianity is that you sort of would want to make some appeal to the moral argument, that these morals sort of intrinsically make sense at a human level, and that they appeal to something that you would find, even though you wouldn't find its expression more widely, you wouldn't expect to just see horror and brutality and then say like, oh, in this one stream of history where people happen to be influenced by these ideas, this is Christianity, so it's true. Because, like I said, Tom Holland is saying that, well, no, that's conditioning your judgments about it being true.
Mm.
So it's almost like an argument that it's not true, because it's like it's not true universally, it's not true evolutionarily, it's not true in the rest of the world, it's just true in the West, and it's only you think it's good in the West because of the sort of contingencies of history. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think Christians should be sort of rejecting this, or at least partially rejecting it. Certainly its wholesale form of kind of like relativism, essentially.
Yes, I mean, it certainly does throw into doubt, a lot of Christians I've met who use the moral argument will say something like, oh, you have, there is an ethic, a universal ethic inscribed on our hearts or inscribed on our souls. I mean, this idea that like there is some way in which if we all sat down and thought about it, we could converge on a set of ethical truths that we would think, okay, yeah, that is objective and amenable to reason. And obviously, I hold different positions. I disagree with that, but that seems to me to be like a pretty important part of the moral argument. It's certainly quite an important part if you're going to argue for things like the objectivity of morality. A very good plank to have in your argument there is that, oh yeah, no, in some sense we will be able to converge upon the right system of ethics in the same way that, we can converge on the right system of physics and the right system of chemistry by doing repeated observations and stuff like that. It seems like that's quite an invaluable plank. And yeah, I think you're right that in some ways the kind of interesting part of Tom Holland's dominion is its kind of radical relativism, is where it kind of says, no, like you can't get at these the morality that you currently have now through reason or through kind of a universal intuition or anything like that. You are so culturally determined. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that does certainly take the wind out of the sails of something like the moral argument. Is there, I mean, thinking about the contrast between the Christian and the Roman world, if I was going to try and defend that position, I mean, could we say something like, well, if we look at the way that European and American, or kind of, quote unquote Western, although I've become a bit allergic to the term Western over time, but let's say like Western morality, we see things like the kind of the equality of women, relative equality of women, let's say, a kind of rights-based moral system that, at the very least, is historically anomalous. And in as much as it's historically anomalous, and in as much as maybe we could argue that, the important difference here between that moral system and certain alternative moral systems is this kind of intervention of Christianity as a cultural force. Is there room there for a kind of argument of kind of the special intervention of Christianity in history, or do you think that's kind of? I mean, I know it's not necessarily of much apologetic value, but do you think that's an argument worth pursuing for Christians?
I think that it is, but it's got its limits. So, for example, I think like Tom Holland's argument, it's stronger when it's on specifics and weaker when it's on generalizations. So you can show, for example, the role of Christians in the development of things like hospitals. You can point to the Christians in Caesarea and say, look, they're founding hospital. So it's because of the things that they believe. So it's historically you're showing that something has happened. I think the kind of what you alluded to there was you look at sort of like modern rights movements, and then you do what both Tom Holland tends to do and Glenn Scrivener does, is you argue by analogy, in the sense of like, here's something in the modern world, you don't find it anywhere else. It kind of can be said to be like this idea in Christianity, therefore Christianity caused it. And what you're sort of doing is you're kind of moving outside of the realm of history, and you're arguing much more. It's almost like a philosophical argument for why we do things and about whether ideas really can influence people in that sort of way. Because in many of the things that you're talking about, you can point to contingent material circumstances that are changing, that appear to drive what's going on. So something like feminism, for example, seems to be driven by technological, societal, economic changes and self-interest. People are arguing for things that are good for them in a particular context. Now, you can argue that there's the concept of rights legally goes back through Christian history, but the question is what is either a Christian or a historian gaining from saying feminism is Christian then? In the very abstract sense, you might be able to say, well, Christianity is what sets something, the West apart from another culture, but it's not the same thing as attributing things that happen to it. It's not really meaningful in its context. It's like you asking me why I went to the shops this morning to get a pint of milk, and then me saying, well, because in 4000 BC, somebody invented the gold ingot and came up with the idea of currency. And so, and so that's why I went to get milk. And it's like, well, I went to get milk because there was no milk in the fridge, and it's sort of like, it's a question of what the purpose is in the question that you're asking, and whether what you're coming up with really even answers any questions, or it sort of implies actually something else that you think about why we do things historically, which in Tom Holland's case seems to be because there's a kind of inevitable determinism to ideas. That Tom Holland's, his thesis seems to be much more that kind of like ideas have this inevitable trajectory, and they're kind of like the image he used, I think, once was like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and he talked about the kind of ripples of it going all the way out and being felt by like sheep farmers in Cumbria. And it's the idea that this idea has this kind of rippling effect throughout history. And yes, but the problem is that he sees it as a kind of changing thing rather than like continuously the same thing. Whereas a Christian will want to argue there's some core of truth that is like moves through history and things come out of it. And so you question what you gain from arguing that things that sort of seem unrelated to it sort of are it really is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So whenever I have talked about this in the past, it seems like what somebody leaning on this for at least quasi, maybe not kind of straightforward apologetic purposes, but let's say like cultural apologetic purposes. Because I think a lot of the time it's not that people are trying to argue for the existence of God through this. Though actually, I think there's an argument in Glenn's book where he talks about trying to pin a kind of apologetic stake in this through saying it's the fact that there's been this great moral inversion that seems so unlikely is itself kind of evidence for Christianity. Now, I don't personally believe that argument, and he knows that I don't. But I think that seems to be an attempt to use the historical thesis there for kind of heavyweight apologetic purposes, at least. Let's say I don't think the argument works, but I think that is like a well-constructed argument, or it's an argument that kind of drives an apologetic purpose. I think that it seems like for the more cultural apologetic stuff, it seems like somebody using this argument would need to cut a line between, on the one hand, the kind of almost trivial truth that anyone can accept, that I can accept. And in fact, I think that it would be almost mad not to accept that kind of Christianity, in as much as we define it as a broad intellectual movement and physical movement consisting of all the things that Christians have done and all the things that Christians have believed. Clearly, we are living in the wake of that, because it was a dominant intellectual and cultural force in Europe for 1500 years at least, and possibly more than that, depending on exactly where you draw the line. So yeah, and there's one, on the one hand, it seems like that doesn't hold much kind of apologetic mustard, I suppose, or cut much apologetic mustard. But on the other hand, we don't want to end up going from the trivial but true thesis to the radical but false thesis that like everything good is, and trying to cut off, trying, for example, to say things like, Christianity has uniquely, for example, or Christianity, well, we should attribute the abolition of slavery to Christianity, despite the fact that obviously at the time it was a kind of intra-Christian dispute. You have people arguing for slavery on the basis of the Bible and people arguing against slavery on the basis of the Bible. I don't know. Is there a kind of way of cutting the middle ground here, even in theory? And if so, what would this look like as a kind of cultural apologetic argument based on history for the, ethical superiority, I suppose, of Christianity as a kind of social force? Is there room there, or do you just think that's a kind of pipe dream?
Well, I think there's a kind of a Scylla and a Charybdis here, and the other extreme of the Tom Holland argument is kind of like the sort of Steven Pinker Enlightenment argument that, like, thank goodness we got rid of religion. Like, everything about our values comes from just obvious reason and reflection and science and progress. And, like, if you just think about it, like, humanism is obvious. So why don't we all just accept these values? And, it was kind of, but perhaps that was something that was sort of assumed within the sort of movements of, like, new atheism, that, like, there's these values that are just obvious, that, like, we all know what's good, like, we all know you shouldn't do bad things, and, like, we just, and I think if you can use Tom Holland's argument to take aim at anything, it is that like, Christianity is not this superstitious regressive force, that you probably are dependent on Christianity in ways that are, in ways that you take for granted. I think in terms of the argument, you would have to marry it to the moral argument, in the sense that you have to argue that we have this intrinsic moral ability to recognize what's morally good. And then you would have to argue that Christianity constitutes something like the highest expression of that moral good. Whereas, as opposed to going the other way, is that this expression comes into history and it influences the reason why you think it's good. In that you have to say, like, if you think about it like this, you'd have to start by saying, do you think compassion is good? And if somebody says yes, look, here's Christianity, it gives you a grounding for compassion, as opposed to the kind of Glenn Scrivener argument, which is, you already think compassion is good, don't you? And then somebody's like, yes. And it's like, well, the reason you think it's good is because Christianity has influenced the West for 2,000 years. Therefore, you should be a Christian. And it's a similar argument, but it's shifting the sort of domain of recognition and cause to something that's universal, as opposed to something that's contingent. Because if it's contingent, it seems like it's not an argument for its truth. And I think that it's a kind of tightrope that's not being walked particularly well. As to the more cultural issue, I tend to find these arguments are almost always bad. It's very popular at the moment to say, like, society is declining. We need Judeo-Christian values to save our societies. It's like the kind of the mantra of the ARC conference and all this kind of stuff. And it's always massively generalized. It's never kind of like, it sort of tends to sort of associate like economic, social, societal flourishing with Christianity in a way that's always ambiguous, in a way that suggests that decline is somehow the result of values declining. And there's so many things going on that it tends to just be a kind of signal for just generalized talk about a kind of cultural essentialism that we're losing. And there is an argument that there are values to Christianity that are good, and that if we just drift away from them, society will get worse. But you sort of have to believe Christianity, and you have to believe its values are good. And I think you can't really do it with the Tom Holland argument, because Tom Holland's arguing that a bunch of post-Christian stuff is Christian. He's not arguing for essentialist Christianity that kind of like is, and all this stuff is bad. He's saying it's all Christian. Like, you can't separate it out. Like, rights movements are Christian, trans activists are Christian. And so you can't be like, oh no, there's trans people, we need Christianity to save us. Tom Holland's saying that they're arguing for Christian reasons. And that, like, the history of the 20th century is like a kind of a tussle between a more conservative version of Christianity and what he would basically call a sort of, he would call kind of secular liberalism basically a form of Christianity, like a wing of Christianity. And so if you're taking that argument, it's all Christianity. And so you can't really use that as a like, well, we're losing Christianity, because he would say, well, it's all motivated by Christianity. Like, if you think, somebody being oppressed is bad, that's Christian as well. Like, there's no, it's hard to make this kind of simplistic argument work.
Yeah, so there's almost like two definitions of Christianity going on there. On the kind of, let's call it like the ARC side of things, for the sake of having a label. I've never been to their conference, but let's just say like I say, for the sake of having a label something. Yeah, this kind of like, we need Christianity in quite a narrowly defined sense in order to safeguard, values A through Z or A through Z that we we already consider worthwhile. And then there's a kind of Tom Hollandist definition of Christianity, whereby even the people challenging those values that the kind of archist is looking to defend are working within a kind of are within that kind of framework of Christianity. And yeah, you're right. These kind of don't play that nicely together. I also think you're right. I've got my copy of Dominion here. I think you're absolutely right that I think that when I've been kind of, before this interview is kind of, rereading bits of it to remind myself of the contents of the book. And I think that it's interesting reading it back with it in mind as not necessarily, as not giving a version of the kind of apologetic Dominion thesis, and instead as sort of being a loose reply to that kind of Pinkeresque, maybe A.C. Grayling. I really like A.C. Grayling's philosophical work, but this is a point of with which I disagree. The kind of this idea that religion gave us 1,500 years of darkness and nothing there was minimal intellectual progress, and then thank God for the Enlightenment and everything was great there. I'm not saying the Enlightenment wasn't great, but I think that is a historical thesis. I think is somewhat simplified.
Simplistic.
Yes, and I think actually reading it back with that framing, I think is one way to get kind of the best bits out of the book, because they say it's written in 2019. I think that's almost like if we were to kind of reconstruct the intellectual dialectic at that point in the conversation, it probably was more a sort of reply to these kind of humanism is obvious, Enlightenment gave us everything we need, religion was just this, persecuting various different Galileos for centuries, and then all of a sudden everything was fine again. And I think actually as a reply to that thesis, it works very, very well as saying, no, actually the situation's much, much more complicated than that. I say that you do a similar job by talking about, the history of Christian scholarship or something like that, humanism as growing out of Christianity, and there's room for a reply to that thesis. But as I say, I think that when it comes to apologetics, it does a much less good job.
Well, Tom Holland actually did a debate with A.C. Grayling. I think it was on Unbelievable. I think it was one of the times I watched Tom Holland where you just felt like everything he said kind of was right, because A.C. Grayling was kind of leaning on what seemed like sort of a cliche, which is just like Christianity was just smashing up the ancient world. Like all our values come from getting rid of it. And Tom Holland seemed like he had the much stronger position, because he was saying, he was sort of pointing out things that A.C. Grayling was saying that weren't even correct. And it kind of, it felt like that to some degree. I think atheists or sort of humanists of a certain kind have a problem with the Tom Holland argument as well, because they want to believe, or a certain type of that kind of person wants to believe that their morals or their kind of view of the world is obvious, that it's kind of like recovered from the axial age. It's what A.C. Grayling argues in this debate, that it's just a kind of recovery done by Enlightenment thinkers. And if you just reflect on our common humanity, you just get all of these moral values. And the kind of response to that is, it's interesting that I don't think the response to that is necessarily, or Tom Holland's response to that is necessarily a Christian response. It's a response from that perspective, which is that why would you not assume that your values are historically contingent? If you don't believe that there are universal morals, you believe you're just a creature that's evolved and that history would also have some evolutionary characteristic, why would it not be obvious that you can trace the lineage of your moral values, that they be different to the values of another society, and that given how saturated we are in Christianity, why would you not credit a lot of your values to Christianity? Now, obviously, for a Christian, you're going after, that would be going after them on the basis of their worldview, because you're saying, well, there isn't a moral reality. But I think that they have somewhat, the Tom Holland problem or argument could give them a bit of a problem. And I think it perhaps has. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not a problem that would necessarily lead you to Christianity. It might just be a problem that would lead you to a less naive version of humanism, for example. Because you could still absolutely say, I don't believe in God, and I recognize that something like humanism might be contingent on Christianity, but it doesn't matter. To say that it's true would be the genetic fallacy, and so it's fine.
Yes, I think it seems like for both the kind of Enlightenment worshipper and the sort of hardcore apologist style Tom Hollandist. It seems like the thing that they're doing in both cases, which I think, which I actually think in book length treatments often they aren't doing, but when it gets filtered down to the kind of the level of popular discussion, it often does get down to this level, which is that they both tend to take like a very, very broad intellectual movement with loads of people disagreeing within them and sort of pick out the true path of that movement based on what was successful in hindsight. Like my question when I kind of had this discussion with Glenn on his channel was that, like, it seems like for an apologetic, for like, if we're going to use a kind of apologetic style framing on the Tom Holland argument, what we need is to say something like Christianity planted the seeds of these particular value systems, and we can identify where these values have kind of grown. They've kind of sprouted. They've kind of, and now we're eating the fruit of those values. And you know, I think that argument seems to rest on the ability to tell at any given particular period in history whether what's happening is a kind of positive growth of the original seed or a kind of corruption of the original seed, where it's kind of growing in the darkness or morphing into this kind of horticultural metaphor has totally got away from me. But, you know, like the ability at any point in history to be able to tell whether this doctrinal development was a positive thing or a negative thing. And so it seems to me that I don't know, maybe there's room here for a kind of Tom Hollandist apologetic marrying with John Henry Newman's ideas on doctrinal development. But it does seem like there needs to be something there so that we can tell at any given time what the correct direction for the seed to grow is. Because as you've said before, you know, a lot of what we consider to be progress made by Christianity is kind of heavily disputed within the Christian movement in such a way that at the time it would be very difficult to tell, you know, is the person arguing for the abolition of slavery on the basis that we're all created in God's image? Is that the growth direction? Or is it the person arguing that actually, you know, Peter 1 gives you good reason to think that God doesn't have a particular problem with the institution of slavery, and actually, you know, slaves should obey their masters. And that's actually the kind of the correct flowering of Christian doctrine. Do you think that there is a kind of, you know, departing from kind of historical basis, do you think that there are possibly good kind of theological criteria to be able to draw upon there that we could use to kind of bolster this argument?
Well, I suppose that the response anybody would give if you did would be to say that your, like Tom Holland would say, your selection of the criteria itself would be arbitrary upon just the point where it happens to have reached. So, Christian, you do have to accept that there is a kind of a sort of evolution of Christian ideas. And, you know, I mean, a lot of these, whenever you watch debates on this topic, it does always end up at slavery. And so, you know, you can absolutely point back through Christian history and point at people who are arguing, at least in some form, for abolition. You know, if something like Gregory of Nyssa reads the ideas in the Bible and says, I think slavery is wrong, or somebody like Bartholomew de las Casas is arguing that, I mean, interestingly, he's arguing that people in the New World shouldn't be enslaved because they have souls. And his first solution to it is, well, you need to enslave Africans instead.
Oh, blimey.
He does later on change his mind about it. But it's, I think that as a Christian, you can get away with coming up with these, you know, with my criteria of Christianity as I understand it, where I see it in history, that's the thing that's true. Now, obviously, to anybody else, that's always going to be arbitrary. But I think that you're not, if you're doing that, you're not arguing so much for causation, you're arguing for example. So you say, here's this thing I believe, and then, like, here's an example of a person in history who believed it, and here's what they did. Rather than, like, you know, here's what I believe history kind of like caused it or something. So I think you start with example because it's kind of going from the sort of universal or from the belief back and saying like I suppose that's more pragmatic in the sense that it's kind of pragmatic by example. It's kind of like, look at what this belief did to a particular person, as opposed to look at what this generalized phenomenon has done throughout history.
Yes, yeah, maybe there's something that maybe there's. I think you've raised a really important point, because I do think that there's a difference in persuasiveness of this argument based on whether it is whether you are kind of assuming Christianity. Because I suppose if you're already a Christian, then it becomes evidence of the kind of Holy Spirit working through history, right? Because you've already got that kind of prior belief. You can kind of, it sort of becomes, I know I've occasionally heard the term suasive argument, where it's not persuasive to anyone that doesn't, that already disagrees, but it's like a way of developing within a particular worldview. And maybe there's something there, a kind of intra-Christian idea of like, oh, we can kind of pick out the Christian thread throughout history in hindsight under the assumption that Christianity is true. Though again, I suppose it also doesn't do much apologetic work there against kind of atheism.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue that if you're starting with a kind of a moral, an acceptance, there is something that is moral that can be accepted to be universal. You can argue that there is something about the person of Jesus that is, like a lot of the arguments of like Tom Holland will point to the kind of the radicalism and the extremeness of the image of the cross. That it's kind of like, and it's true that the cross is kind of a merism that you have, in the age of DB Filius, you have the idea that God himself is kind of suffers this death that Seneca says is not suitable for anyone but a slave, because for a Roman citizen to die that way would just be utterly humiliating. And that you can, if you accept that there is something that is moral, if you believe that there are morals, you can point to it and say this is the kind of highest expression of those morals at all. And here are places where it sort of is people believe it, people adopt the idea, and things happen as a result of it. But it's kind of the thing is with that argument can become too general, and that the result is that you essentially act like there's only ever been one original idea, and that anything else historically that looks like that idea is that idea sort of being instantiated. And I think that's what Tom Holland's doing. That's sort of what Glenn Scrivener tries to do a little bit. But you don't want to do that as a Christian. As a Christian, you want to argue that actually, if you see somebody arguing that it's bad to oppress somebody, it's legitimate to say, well, it's not just because that one idea 2,000 years ago causally influenced society such that they think that it's bad to oppress somebody. It's because it really is bad to oppress somebody. And you're kind of, sounds kind of obvious, but that is what a Christian's trying to argue. Whereas that's not, it's kind of quite important. I think a lot of people don't get with the Tom Holland argument is that's not what he's arguing. He's not arguing that it's bad to oppress people. He's arguing that the reason you think it's bad to oppress people is because of just this kind of weathering of history. Interestingly, Nietzsche comes up all the time in this. Nietzsche is kind of the one, like, I suppose it's become just a cliche that you just quote Nietzsche and say that, look, Nietzsche is what it looks like to repudiate Christianity. And so it's the kind of the modern version of the sort of like the Roman or Christian, that like Christianity is a slave religion. It's all about, cast aside the botched and the weak. I'm not an expert on Nietzsche, but it's always the same quotes. It is
a particular view on Nietzsche that kind of gets wheeled out as sort of quasi Satan to kind of après moi le déluge.
And then the Nazis follow on from Nietzsche. And he says that basically it's Christianity or the Nazis. If you think it's bad to oppress somebody, you must be a Christian, because if you're not, what it looks like to repudiate Christianity is to be Nietzsche, and that basically ends up with the Nazis.
Yeah, which is I think it's strange because actually there's a point in, actually I won't be able to find it now, but I think there's a point in Tom Holland's book where he argues that in many ways for example, the anti-Semitism of the Nazis is based on the kind of prior, partly based on the prior anti-Semitism, like genealogically based in the same way that he thinks that that our conception of love is genealogically based on Christianity. Sorry, go on.
There was a tract by Martin Luther displayed at a Nuremberg rally. I can't remember what exactly the title of it was, but it was something like "The Jews and Their Lies" that Martin Luther wrote at the end of his life. It's absolutely is appalling.
No, because in some ways it's it seems like you can make a kind of argument that like in with this framing, like the Nazis become Christian, and I don't want to say that really. Like I think that it's like self-evidently not true. Like I think that at that point we stretch our definition of Christianity like so broad. Like in a similar way that I suppose you could argue that the kind of I think I can't remember if Tom Holland does do this or if this is just somebody I've kind of read stretching his argument, but you could kind of make the argument that the kind of universality of something like Stalinism or Bolshevism in the USSR is kind of drawing on Christian foundations to do with the building building the New Jerusalem or something like that. I mean, you could try and draw a genealogical link there and say that it seems like the Bolsheviks are also Christian, but I think but at that point we seem to have stretched our definitions so far that at the very least it's not. It is drifted a long way from ordinary usage of Christian as a person who subscribes to a series of beliefs about the Bible and the resurrection.
There's a lot of dominion that's quite historically rigorous, but it gets to a certain point about 3/4 of the way through where he starts to shift into this kind of mode of arguing that's exactly like what you just said, where you're arguing by kind of likeness or analogy. And this is partly an argument that he's kind of popularized it a bit, and a lot of people's kind of do it. That like here's some idea, it's kind of similar to an idea that's always been in Christianity. Where else does it come from? Therefore, it's Christian. And so, like for example, he argues that homosexuality is fundamentally Christian because the word homosexual it's coined in like the late 19th century, and his argument is that Paul's condemning homosexuals. Like Aquinas condemned sodomy. So like we get the category of the idea of homosexuality from Christianity, and we wouldn't have it without it. And it's like, there's no, like, people who come up with the word aren't saying I'm doing this because I'm a Christian. And it's sort of developed by people who are sort of writing medical texts about kind of sexual preferences and things. And it's just all a bit of a kind of like,
But it's interesting because I suppose that Tom Holland, like writing as a secular author, is kind of within his rights to kind of do that sort of thing. As in, because he can define Christianity as broadly as he wants. He can kind of say, because it seems like by the end of the book he's using a definition of Christianity whereby, the anything that grows from this kind of initial set of beliefs that eventually become so ubiquitous in Europe and that almost everything ends up owing something to that set of beliefs. However obliquely, and I'm happy for him to use that definition. I think in some ways it's like quite helpful to read it through. I think, as you said earlier, I think it does do something to supplant your pre-existing or many people's pre-existing idea that our morals are just self-evident. They don't come from anywhere. They kind of they're just they're just everywhere. If I was born in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, I would believe different thing. I would believe exactly the same thing. I think it's good for supplanting that, and I think his broader use of the term Christian can be helpful there. But I think that it seems to me that is like that definition of Christian is so not what Christian apologists need. Because you can end up saying things like, the terrors of the USSR were fundamentally Christian in nature, and you can make these kinds of arguments. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of C.S. Lewis at the beginning of Mere Christianity, saying that, almost arguing against a very different definition of broadening of the word Christian, where he talks about how, Christian can't just mean a nice, humane, lovely person, because that too is kind of not sticking to that too is kind of cheapening Christianity theologically, which again I think Tom Holland, I imagine, could be like, fine, that just doesn't concern me. It's not part of my concern. But I do think that the way, if we're going to use this line of argument somewhat apologetically, we have to have a narrower definition of Christianity than that.
Well, I think even with Tom Holland, it's kind of it's kind of an overemphasis on the influence of ideas historically, as opposed to the influence of kind of like material changes, economic changes, kind of things that are, so like you could compare the arguments that feminism is Christian to something like the arguments for, if you take something like the Peasants' Revolt or something, you could make the Tom Holland argument for the Peasants' Revolt and say it's all about like poor people want equality. It's all about the Garden of Eden, where there's that famous John Ball, the preacher, who says when Adam delved and Eve spun, who was then a gentleman who was supposed to be stirring up people, for the peasants revolt. And you say, well, it's all just a paramount Christian movement. And it's like, actually, if you look at the circumstances, it's the period after the Black Death. There's a massive amount of social mobility because so many people have died. There's a whole load of new opportunities. People are angry because there's this taxation to fund the 100 Years' War. And it kind of just boils up into kind of popular resentment that's stoked, and then people charge to London and do a bunch of burning and killing. It's like, you could argue that it's sort of Christian, but it's an seems like an overemphasis on the role of ideas that are present but aren't really causing what's going on. And I don't think either the historian or a Christian, because a Christian could say, well, it's all Christian. And it's like, well, was beheading the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Tower of London, were they Christian then when they were doing that? It's like you've either got to own what you really define as Christian, or you've got to own all of it. And I suppose, you're right that Tom Holland could say, well, they're all Christians, and a historian doesn't have to, the distinctions don't matter to a historian. It's kind of, I suppose partly what your definition there is doing is sort of making Western and Christian much more synonymous, so that you're increasing the emphasis on how Christian the Western world is, but you're still using it as a word for basically everything. Like everything that happens is kind of Christian, to use the word, but it's not a direct product of like direct Christian belief all the time. It's kind of like a flowering of its seedbed, to use a horticultural metaphor again.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I think that your point about ideas, because I sometimes wonder this historically, and I'm aware that lots of people have thought much more about it than I have. But there's a point at I think when can we justifiably attribute an event in history to an idea versus a material circumstance when they're so inseparable, and also we can't rerun it. So I can't go back 700 or so years ago and say, right, so we're going to rerun it, but we're going to make you all pagan, and we're going to see what happens. There is a real kind of
trouble because still get angry with taxation.
Yeah, exactly. There's an open question of how we normally test causation is to say, okay, we're going to intervene here, and then we're going to see what effects it has, and then if it doesn't have many effects, we'll say, okay, well, I guess that wasn't a causal factor, or we can kind of justifiably doubt that being a causal factor. And if loads of things change, we can go, okay, yeah, that's probably pretty causally efficacious. And it seems like in history we just can't quite do that. I don't want to relegate ideas totally to the kind of a causal dustbin, because I think that maybe this is just an unjustified belief I have about myself and other people, but it seems like beliefs do some causal work in our behavior. And that will probably that probably also held for people in the past. But at the same time, I think material circumstances are so evidently important. I don't know. There's a bit in Charles Taylor's The Secular Age where he kind of about midway through the book says, you may think that I'm being too idealist, and I probably am. But also the idea, it's not like we can take the material circumstances and take the ideas and separate them and test them independently. They're just mushed together. I don't even know which of my behaviors are motivated more by material circumstance and which are motivated more by ideas. It's almost impossible to tell from a first-hand perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that when there's a certain point where you're not really doing history anymore. You're sort of doing a kind of philosophy in terms of arguing about why people do the things that they do, because a lot of history is just about epistemology. You're just showing that something happened, and going to argue what happened at the Battle of Crécy or something. You read all the contemporary accounts and try to piece together what happened. And if you're trying to argue for people's motives, you're just looking for evidence that they had a certain motive, in the sense that things that they said or things that people said about them or whatever. Whereas if you're arguing it in this much more general sense, that kind of an idea continues to exist throughout it, almost like the idea is reaching down and influencing people, is you're kind of the philosophical argument is sort of going to be above the historical argument. You're kind of arguing for to me at that point, you sort of have to see history more in the way that you would see literature. because we in this moment now, the idea that history is a chain of material causes isn't much meaning to me. It doesn't help me decide what I'm going to do, and it doesn't help me decide what I'm going to believe and what I'm going to think. And that's why we read literature, and that's why we like things that give us a sense of example, because it relates, things that other people do or what we might imagine other people do to our own consciousness and our own choices, as opposed to just seeing history as sort of like, cause. You see it as a calcified record of people who have made choices in the same way that you have choices before you. And I'm not sure how much of that is compatible with the Tom Holland argument. I think it's more materialist than that, but it's sort of trying to incorporate ideas into part of the materialist cause. Whereas I think when you are thinking about history more in relation to ideas, you are thinking more in relation to your own, like, well, what do I think and what am I going to do and what am I going to believe? And you're in a slightly different domain. It's not that anybody isn't entitled to be in that domain as a popular historian, but I suppose it is worth acknowledging that it's slightly different to just saying this happened and then this happened.
Yes, yeah. And the kind of how to take broad sections of history and kind of tell them narratively in a way that kind of makes sense of them. Because I think part of history is attempting to make sense of things rather than just sort of listing facts. While at the same time not simplifying things is, I don't know, it strikes me as an incredibly difficult task, and I don't envy historians who have to do it. Because because it's like, it seems like one of the things we want to be able to tell out of historical study is, okay, like what kind of roughly caused this? Like the classic 13-year-old British history question is what caused the First World War, right? It's like almost in every child in the UK will study a module on how did the First World War start. And they will go they'll look at kind of the crises in the Balkans, and they'll look at the evolution of different alliances. They'll look at economic stuff, and they'll try and that's not just listing facts. That's trying to make sense of it in a way that I think bears some superficial relationship to how we think about science, in terms of that it involves causes, it involves like why questions and explanations, but is importantly different to science because we can't run tests. And I know that people say things like, oh yeah, well we can reason probabilistically, but then there's what's my sample? Genuinely, I think that the epistemology of history itself, especially as we go further back, I remember having this, again, bringing this kind of back to the Tom Hollander stuff. I've occasionally been asked, what do you think the world would look like if Christianity hadn't happened? And I kind of go, I've literally no idea. Like, I don't even know what the world would look like if, like, Margaret Thatcher hadn't been elected, and that's like much that is much closer to my time, and I still don't know what the world would look like.
It's almost an absurd question.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a question that I don't think I'm in a position to answer, and also just don't think anyone's in a position to answer. Like, I just think that I'm not saying that there's no answer in principle. I just think that you need so much information, quite a lot of which has been lost to time. And again, I think that it's difficult to say much about the impact of Christianity in toto without simply devolving into the more trivial thesis of like, yeah, okay, we're all products of the past. Like, cool. Like, I knew that, but it doesn't do very much. I think it's interesting though, coming from your perspective, because although this is a pragmatic, often used as a pragmatic argument for belief in God that you don't agree with, you have given pragmatic arguments, or you have kind of endorsed pragmatic arguments that do, or you think might encourage people to justifiably either believe in God or work towards more kind of religiosity in some sense. What are some of those arguments, and why do you find them so persuasive?
Well, I'm quite a fan of William James. So William James famously wrote a book called Varieties of Religious Experience, which is kind of like the archetypal pragmatic. I suppose it's not really an argument for religion, but it's kind of, I suppose the pragmatist position is inherently agnostic, that William James is not arguing that God exists, but he's kind of showing that, here's a bunch of examples of quite how radically religious belief seems to change people, and that change seems to be good. I mean, of course, you have to have categories of judgment that you assume as good, and I'm sure that Tom Holland would stand here and say your categories the categories of William James were just Christian categories. But I don't think that's true. I think there is a universal not universal, but there's a something we share as human beings, that we know what it is to have good experience and we know what it is to have bad experience. And I think that if you think about a state like depression, where a person would think of the world as meaningless, of empty, of things not having any inherent connection, of being dull, and you think about its extreme, the extreme opposite, that the world is inherently meaningful and good, that everything is intrinsically connected, that the value in your life really exists. The difference between those two states is a difference between a belief that the world is those things and a belief that it isn't. And you could argue that it's irrelevant, that there's just experience, and then we could just have beliefs about experience, but they're not really connected and they're just arbitrary. Or you could argue that you can think the world intellectually is dark, empty, and meaningless, and have meaning in your life. But I think a pragmatic argument would say, look, you know, the experience that you have can be changed radically by having certain beliefs about the world. And that when it comes to things that we can't prove, you know, this is an important way of looking at it. It's a valuable way of looking at it. I think it's not a whole argument. I think William James ends varieties of religious experience ultimately as an agnostic, but I think it is a useful way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think there's I mean, I remember. I think that first of all, I think William James' variety of religious experience is fantastic, and everyone should go read it. But this just reminds me of a way in which I think that I made this point to Gavin Ortland once, where I said, occasionally I think that the attempt to make a pragmatic case for Christianity or for religion often significantly overplays its hand in a way that I don't think it needs to. For example, it's sometimes is said that okay, without churches, people will atomize and there'll be no community. And I just sort of think, well, we don't actually need a necessary connection there. We can just make the argument based on the fact that, regardless of whether there can be community without churches, and I think there can be, churches are ready-made communities that are probably near you. And if you're feeling lonely, that can be sufficient reason to try it out. Like I think in some ways the kind of, I say the quote-unquote cultural apologist often wants to have like religion or Christianity as a necessary condition of something else, when actually I think they can get by on a much weaker point, or a much, not weaker in the sense of worse, but weaker in the sense of, needing far less to demonstrate, which is just that, yeah, you can have community without religion, but religions are very, very good ways to find community. You're more likely to be near a church with a bunch of committed people that want to go there every week and you can chat to than you are, for example, to be near a chess club with that same level of commitment. It's not that chess clubs couldn't, in theory, kind of replicate that. It's not like a kind of metaphysically necessary thing. It's just that it just so happens that your local church probably is a good, ready-formed community, and you'll meet some lovely people there. That in and of itself is a pragmatic reason for people to go to church if they're feeling lonely. And we don't necessarily need to put on top of that the idea that, and by the way, without churches, the whole of society will collapse. You can just get by on saying it's better. It doesn't have to be like après moi le déluge,
Yeah, I suppose I find the pragmatic arguments less strong when they get outside of the kind of personal or like the individual. So the pragmatic argument for Christianity, like societally or culturally at the moment, is very popular. And I don't find that to be as good, because I think that it's, like you said, you're kind of arguing for something that you could get it in other ways. Like you're arguing that, we need it for like unity across our society, or we need it for whatever, and it's like, well, you could have that with any religion. You could have it with, if everyone, and the new atheists thought that we could have it if everyone became a new atheist like them. And maybe if they did, we would. I think the personal argument is better. I think that, you talk about church appealing to kind of loneliness, is it's sort of, it's appealing to something that you already share, that you have those kind of experiences. You can understand it. You can understand that the concept of community in church really does come from the New Testament. That's not some historical causal argument. It's that, Jesus said you should love one another. And there's appeal that, well, what happens when you do love one another in a community? Well, it's, it appeals to your psychological needs as a human being. And so it's good. I think once you're then trying to argue, well, we need that or else our society is going to decline, it's like, well, maybe our society is declining for other reasons.
Mm. Yes, yeah. I suppose that, again, there's that kind of attempt to draw a causal link between kind of grand ideas and states of society, which probably have far more complex causes.
Yes, I mean, it's just become a meme now. So like Nigel Farage constantly goes on about Judeo-Christian. Interestingly, he was at the art conference. I think it was 56 seconds I timed it into his speech before he said Judeo-Christian culture. It's like, does Nigel Farage want us all to become Christians? I don't think he does. I think he says he doesn't. He refuses to go. He refuses to go to church because of their woke agenda. And it's like, well, again, I can hear Tom Holland saying that woke is Christian anyway.
Yes, I mean, again, that's clearly two different uses of the term Christian. And I mean, I think there's also something in here, I think, about, clearly it seems like what most Christian, certainly, I'm kind of an agnostic, but I'm very amenable to Christianity. I read a lot of Christian literature. I find it very emotionally compelling. I go to church semi-regularly. So I'm like the epitome of a kind of culturally Christian-esque agnostic.
Yeah.
And while I love that, I love Christian literature. I love reading, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy's later works, and I like reading Gregory of Nyssa, for example. For just incredible writer, if nothing else. And I think theologically seems very sound from my agnostic perspective. But when I go kind of looking for God, I certainly go looking for something slightly more significant than a social tool. I had this discussion with Jonathan Pajot when he and I talked about things. He's got his idea about God being the top of a symbolic hierarchy. And I've recently had this discussion with Paul van der Klee as well. Though that won't be out for a few months. Where similarly, he's talking about, God being at the top of a value hierarchy and fulfilling an important social role. And I think, okay, all that's fine. But I want to know if Jesus rose from the dead, and I want to know if there's an afterlife, and I want to know if I want to know if when I die, will I continue having experiences, and will one of those experiences be, will I, cease to be, or will I have to start apologizing pretty quickly? Might be, for example, a question that I kind of want to know the answer to. Is there a God out there, and can I have a relationship with him? And these are, these might be socially useful, but they also seem like they're more than that. I want to know if this is true. I want to know if I will have that experience.
Yeah, I remember watching something a while ago with John Vervaeke, the guy who talks about the meaning crisis. And he said one of the things he did in his class of students was ask people to put their hands up and say, if you knew that your girlfriend or whatever was cheating on you and didn't really love you, but you could decide to just have the memory erased and you could not know about it and you'd just be happy for the rest of your life, would you want it? And that they all put their hands up and said, no, I wouldn't want it because it would be untrue. And he says that the thing about meaning is that people want it to be really real. They actually want it to be true. Not just that they want to kind of it's better if I do this because I might feel a bit better. That they actually want to kind of actually, like you said, that when I die, there will be a continuation of my consciousness, that there is a heaven, that God is really there, that and I think the personal pragmatic arguments in terms of pragmatism are the nearest that you'll get to that. And the cultural arguments are the furthest away that you'll get. Because when it's a social tool, might be good in a contingent sense, in the sense that we judge it as good, but it doesn't make it good in an absolute sense. And I think I'm like you. I want to know that it's really there. Well, I mean, what do you as an agnostic think about the Tom Holland argument? Is there any of it that you find defensible?
I think that,
or persuasive,
for me, I think it's at its most persuasive when I think Tom Holland-esque arguments are their most persuasive when they are linking specific events in the past to specific things we've ended up with now. So actually, I've read more recently, and I can't remember the book. God is an Englishman. That's the name of the book. That I read more recently, and I thought that in many ways, maybe because it was a smaller scope thesis, like there's a whole chapter on, or a whole section on, the relationship between Christianity and the history of English law and stuff. And I was like, that's really interesting, right? I think that kind of argument, while I don't think you can hang apologetic stuff on it, I think is useful for contextual. I think that as a historical thesis, that kind of thing is very persuasive. And I also think actually the individual chapters of of Dominion often do make pretty plausible arguments for specific ways in which modern, or things that we think of as distinctly modern or secular or what have you, have their not necessarily like historical origins, but aren't as new as we think. And in many ways, and as I say, I think that it is at its best when it is countering a very, very simplistic humanist view of history, whereby there is the Dark Ages, which lasted until approximately 1705, and then the Enlightenment happened, and then everything was great. I think that's where the Tom Holland thesis is at its best. I think it is, and whether that's apologetic or not, I think is probably a definitional dispute, because I think that it is very good when you come across people who think, religion poisons everything, and religion has always been bad and universally has been bad and it's never done anything good. And God, if only we didn't have that darned religion, we would all be fine and we'd be living in the space age. I think it's great for countering that kind of thing. And I think God as an Englishman is fantastic for a similar sort of purpose, of making that on a more local scale. That for me is where the argument is at its most solid, where it is correcting an overly simplistic view of history that does, I don't want to deny it. Like, there are plenty of atheists who have this like quite absurd view of history, whereby Christianity was like intellectual Hulk smash, tearing up books, and the kind of new atheist history of the church is that it was a bunch of people burning books all the time. Who was writing the books? Is of course not said, because it was monks. But and I think that as a counter to that view of history, I think it's absolutely like invaluable. I think that as conversations often do, I think the pendulum has just swung too far the other way, that attempting to put this forward as like that I don't think that Tom Holland does this, but the way this thesis has been put forward as a kind of totalizing view of history, that actually everything ever. That when it's kind of in its more apologetic forms, that every good thing is Christian, which is certainly not what Tom Holland says. I think that's when it's at its weakest, but I think it's at its strongest when it is correcting something that definitely did need and still often does need to be corrected.
Yeah, that God is an Englishman book. His name Bijan Omrani. I'll probably pronounce that wrong.
Can't remember. I've got it on ebook, and I never remember the titles of ebooks, because if you get a physical book, you see the cover every time you pick it up. Yeah. Whereas in an ebook, I read on my Kindle. So if I'm reading a book, I might see the cover like once when I just open the book for the first time, and then it's just on the page when I'm hopeless for book titles when it comes to ebooks.
Yeah, I thought that was quite good as well, actually. He says in the introduction, I read Tom Holland's Dominion, and so I'm going to be continuing this. And I was like, oh no. But there's a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of, I think that's a good example of how you can do it. Well, I think the book contains both examples of the kind of the bad of the Tom Holland argument and some good examples of it. So there's the stuff you were talking about English law, things like the neighbour principle, where somebody said, look, I'm doing this because of a verse in the Bible. And then he's citing examples of lawyers saying, there's no Christianity in any of our English laws.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's like, look, this is ridiculous. But then there's other examples in the same book where that I would call is kind of the bad side of the way of arguing that Tom Holland's popularized. So there's one bit where he argues that Y2K is Christian, because he says it's all through our obsession with numbers. And he sort of brings up Bede, and Bede wrote a book called The Reckoning of Time, he's an Anglo-Saxon historian. And it sort of spoke about that there was anxiety around the last millennium that the world was going to end. And he's like, well, so Y2K, thinking the computer's going to end, is all Christian. And it's like, how? Like, anxiety and superstition around numbers is just like a massive universal. It's not Christians who are saying it. None of them have ever read Bede. Like, I never had superstition about numbers in the Christianity I was brought up with. I would say that that's almost, it's not just that I think that that's an argument from analogy. I think it's just wrong. But it's kind of that sort of you kind of have an illustration there of the good side of the Tom Holland argument, like you were saying, that it's a clear historical demonstration of something. It's against the kind of Christianity is all bad and we're not influenced by it. And then the kind of argument from analogy, here's something that's sort of like Christianity, therefore it's Christian. I mean, that's a good example of putting the two together.
The other part of the again, the actual kind of Tom Holland Dominion book that I really like is the kind of shaking someone out of the obviousness of their own morals, which again is not a very that's not a very apologetic job. But it's not an apologetic book, so I don't think that's kind of point against it. But I think that there is a tendency, for example, for people to think, our morality is obvious, or that, for example, the descriptive beliefs upon which we base further moral actions are very obvious. So, a lot of our, moral differences, as A.J. Ayer argued, are like tied up with descriptive differences. For example, the Aztecs when the Aztecs had human sacrifices, they were doing it on like kind of roughly utilitarian calculation, in the sense that they thought that they were feeding the earth and without that everyone would die, which, at ground principle level, that might share some kind of moral similarities with our own reasoning. But I think that if we're to take a moral system not just to be those baseline evaluative principles where you like abstract away from any particular situation, but to include the kind of gamut of social practices and cultural practices and religious practices and ways that people treat one another, I think that reading something like Dominion is fantastic for realizing how different things could have been, and also how different things still are and historically have been at various different places in the world and at various different times in history. I also think that, weirdly, considering how it's often used, I think that Dominion is a very good book for realizing how different Christianity has looked throughout history. Even if we restrict the definition to people who believe in the divinity of Christ, that actually that has looked substantially different at different points in history. And another book, an older book, well, not that older, but older than Dominion, as I mentioned earlier, Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, does a very similar thing, kind of charts various different theological developments in Christian history and tries to make a case for their direct social impact at the time. I think that's also some important for kind of shaking us out of the kind of presentism that often happens if we're just dealing with ideas and not dealing with how they've historically developed.
Does any of it do anything for you as a agnostic that the arguments of Glenn Scrivener haven't fired into your agnostic brain?
I think that the direct apologetic argument in Glenn's book, where he talks about how he thinks that the inversion of, the first shall be last, etc., is so radical and so unlikely that it must have a divine origin, or we're justified in believing it has a divine origin. I don't think that is persuasive to me. I do, however, think that is like a way that you could use the Dominion thesis in a way that has a genuine apologetic conclusion, right? That's a statement saying, okay, this extraordinary thing has happened. It's like not too different from a miracle claim, right? It's saying this extraordinary thing has happened, and the best explanation for it is that it's divine in origin. I don't think it works for the reason that I don't think that the likelihood claim is all that justified there. But that's like, I think that is a more developed way of using the Tom Holland thesis apologetically than, for example, saying that everything is ultimately Christian, which eventually just means that nothing is ultimately Christian. So recently, you kind of branching out from the Tom Holland argument, because I think you have made some interesting arguments yourself about secular ethics and its perhaps shortcomings, right? Because like any ethical system, it will have particular strengths and particular weaknesses. And I can't. Let me look up the exact title of the article, because it was a very kind of eye-catching title. It was called. It was called Psychology and Religious Value. But then you had a photo of Lily Phillips, the OnlyFans or adult actress, who had a documentary made about her where she slept with, I think it was 100 men in 24 hours in what looked what
she's done more something.
Yes, and seemed sort of broadly kind of unhappy about the situation. And there you make a kind of a genuine argument about the possible shallowness of some of our current ethical approaches. Do you mind just kind of saying what you kind of argued there, and where you think actually secularism, as it currentit's exists at least, might fall short a little.
Well, I mean, the whole OnlyFans thing is kind of represented as like the amount of people I've heard say that it's the sign of the end of the world. I think Jordan Peterson did some interview where he said that they represented the whore of Babylon in Revelation, and it's like all this stuff. Yeah, I can't really remember what I wrote, but I mean, I think that it's a kind of it's a pragmatic illustration of we were talking about what certain beliefs engender, and I suppose there's an interesting thing there about that. On one hand, this is clearly being driven by certain notions of freedom and individualism. That it's good that you sort of do whatever you want and that you kind of express your maximal desire as much as possible. And it leads to something that most people can recognize is sort of doesn't seem to lead to happiness in a broader scale. And I think what I'm doing in that article is connecting it to a lot of other kind of forms of individualism that you find, that sort of like ideas around sort of optimization and all this kind of stuff. And that there's a kind of it doesn't seem to be the route to happiness. But I suppose, interestingly, with this whole historical thing is that you could connect it to kind of material changes as well. That why is all this happening? Well, the internet, economic motivations. If you read like Bonnie Blue or Lily Phillips, all of these people's story is the same. As in, I had a job, it was locked down. Suddenly, all I had was my job. My social life was taken away. I had a miserable kind of life ahead of me. So I was like, well, why wouldn't I do it? And there's nothing there's nothing in the ethos of that generation to say like you should pursue virtue. Like we just don't. It's just gone. And I think if you are going to be concerned about the decline of morals in society, if you believe that you could argue that it's Christian morals that are being lost, you could just argue that we just have developed systems that warp priorities. Because to go back to the pragmatic arguments earlier, I think there is some correlation between, you might say, goodness and happiness in some form. That ultimately these things don't seem to lead to happiness on a broader scale. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's the case of Bonnie Blue has been really interesting because it's one of the only times I think where in recent memory where I think that many people have had a reaction to somebody doing something that is like that touches very clearly on typical themes around sacredness. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a because
yes.
all of the standard moral arguments that people tend to use are based around things like happiness and free choice. And of course, Bonnie Blue's, I think, in some ways a more interesting ethical example than Lily Phillips here, because Lily Phillips seems genuine and happy, whereas as far as I can tell, I've not looked into it in particularly very much detail, but but Bonnie Blue seems to genuinely enjoy her work. There's no sign of kind of a seeming sign of her being deeply miserable on the inside. And I think that it's interesting how many from a just a kind of third person viewpoint, how many tweets and commentary I've seen on this that kind of relies on a sort of sacredness disgust response. That's kind of like no, like there's something about the human body that people want to hold dear, separate from questions of happiness and self-ownership, right? I think that's very, very interesting, because I think that this is kind of how conversations about public morality evolve. It's kind of a living counterexample for most people, because if what most people are doing when they're kind of thinking about ethics is kind of roughly trying to take their kind of pre-reflective ethical responses and systematize them into a kind of as coherent and maximal a whole as they can, then this presents a genuine kind of for a lot of people, because of their intuitive kind of push back against this without necessarily knowing exactly why or where it comes from. It kind of presents a counterexample to what for many people is a kind of relatively coherent, a relatively maximal ethical system of, people can kind of do what they want as long as they're not harming others. People can strive for happiness. We should try to maximize happiness. And because I often see debates about this kind of thing kind of follow a quite a similar dialectic whereby, somebody will say, oh, actually this person really is suffering on the inside. And then somebody will say, oh, well, there's no clear sign of that. And somebody would say, oh, well, I think that this person is doing harm to kind of women as a whole. And then somebody responds saying, okay, like maybe, but like, let's just posit for the sake of argument that she wasn't. Would there still be anything wrong with it? And a lot of people will say, oh, it just kind of feels wrong. I know, I found it very, very interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
It's like a kind of reductio ad absurdum of a certain kind of individualism that we all take for granted.
I know, I just thought it was very interesting. You also talk about the kind of concept of, in that same article, you talk about the concept of self-optimization and how that kind of is, you put sort of self-optimizers and kind of OnlyFans creators and kind of actually part of the same sort of intellectual vein. What is it that they share in your view?
I can't remember how I connected. I think the thing is, I think I did a quote by that Stephen Bartlett, who's a Diary of a CEO
Yes,
guy,
yeah.
who he was talking about how he had a glass of wine or something, and he was saying like, I woke up the next day and my dopamine system was all messed up, so I didn't go to the gym, and so like I didn't sleep well the next night, and I slept badly. And then I couldn't go to the gym the day after because of like my cortisol system or something. And then he had like some watch that sponsored his show, and he was like, I measured all of these changes on my watch. So it's like I could, and you kind of were like, it's kind of, you realize that this sort of optimization thing is like a sort of, I can tell you how I connected the two, because the point is that what I said was that if you have a baby, every single one of your optimization markers will go off a cliff. Suddenly you're not getting any sleep. You're not going to be waking up and going to the gym. You've got a screaming child all the time. You're probably not eating properly. All of your watch is going to be going off all the time. I mean, dread to think what your cortisol system or whatever is doing. But the meaning in your life will have expanded in such a way that it never has before. And it's kind of this idea that there's an intrinsic. We come to focus intrinsically on things that we think are giving us meaning, that are they're persuasive to us because they're so immediate and because they're sort of rewarding, or because they persuade us that somehow if I'm optimized, or if I'm making money, or if I'm expressing my individualism in whatever form, then I'm kind of, that it constitutes a kind of meaning, but that it's a sort of carapace over something that it just falls away so easily, and beneath it is a kind of meaninglessness that like I can't cope if my cortisol system is messed up or whatever. And I think the point about religious meaning is that you transcend those things, that it doesn't matter what your cortisol system is doing. You have you have traded that which you can lose for that which you can never lose, in some sense. And this kind of, and that the motivations behind all of these things in some sense are kind of religious, in that they're sort of trying to answer questions of like, how do I get what I really want? How do I become fulfilled? But they're sort of lacking the kind of meaning question of religious ideas. And so they're kind of perpetuating themselves in popular discourse, but they're not answering anybody's questions.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting you bring up that topic about kind of specifically religious meaning, because I sometimes wonder about this. Oh, hair on my mouth. I have a lot of religious friends, and certainly with a few of them, the thing that I kind of envy almost is what I can only describe as a sort of spiritual self-confidence, or a kind of existential self-confidence. You occasionally meet people with sort of truly like unshakable faith, and the reason that I kind of feel a little bit of envy there, and maybe this is just a sign that I kind of can't tough it out in quite the way that I would like. But is that there's a sort of sense, one of my friends is a very, very devout Christian, and he's like, I've seen him go through real hardship, and he's a really, really lovely guy. And whenever that happens to him, he can always kind of draw upon the idea that, look, like it doesn't, literally everything in my life could go horribly wrong. And as long as I have this kind of one North Star, this kind of, this thing, this kind of, this relationship to God, the rest of it doesn't matter. Like, it pales in comparison because this is infinite and that is finite. And of course, I'm sure that that's not like a universal religious experience. Like, I know that, I also know religious people who are very, very troubled and are, despite their faith, remain quite kind of swayed by the kind of vicissitudes of life. But that, maybe it's just because it's my friends, I spend so much time around it. But that as an attitude, I am quite envious of, because it straightforwardly makes sense, right? If you're religious and you think that the main thing really is your relationship with God, and that there's a being out there of infinite import who loves you, and provided that this relationship is on somewhat healthy terms, you can truly say that everything's really okay. And even if what's happened to you is absolutely horrific, you've just had something like, what's like the worst thing that happened to someone, like losing a child or something like that. You could still say, I will see that child again, and that ultimately this, as long as this one thing is holding, everything's going to be okay. I think that, like, I don't know. I mean, you sometimes see this. I think that religious people could draw on that like a lot more. I think that is an intensely enviable position to be in, is to be able to say there is this thing of importance that dwarfs all other stuff.
Yeah, and in a way, you're going back to William James and the argument for the example of what religious belief does to people. So, I mean, William James has this distinction in Varieties of Religious Experience between what he calls once born experience, where people have this kind of, they adopt some philosophy that gives them a kind of naive belief that everything's like love or something. I think he calls that the religion of healthy mindedness, that like, if you just believe that everything's wonderful, it's all going to be great. And he says, well, look, at some point you have to face up to the kind of, just the suffering of history. And he kind of goes on to say, well, there seems to be this religious condition where there are people who look at the horrors of reality and all of its suffering and say, there is still something about this that is intrinsically good, and that you possess this capacity not just to transfigure it, but to kind of transfigure it morally as example. That he calls, he has a chapter he calls saintliness. And I think that is, you're right, that is an argument that I think you have to draw on a lot more. I mean, there are other sides to this. I mean, I grew up in a very religious background, and I remember as a teenager being endlessly frustrated with religious people who, I'd sort of argue with them about Noah's Ark or something. And it's like there is a state of religiousness where your conviction in a particular domain extends to a kind of conviction in all domains, such that you just will not be budged. And I remember sort of feeling a kind of double side of kind of like, on one hand, the kind of enviableness that I just sort of like tortured myself over everything I thought and whether I could know it was true or not. And that it just must be kind of quite nice to just believe something unswervingly. And on the other hand, a kind of slight fear of becoming religious in that way. But yeah.
Yeah, no, there is, like, so I feel like sometimes in like atheist and agnostic circles, of which I'm kind of loosely a part, there is a tendency, I think, to kind of deny the existential strengths of religion in an attempt to be like, oh no, there's like no benefits to this thing. It's like, no, like there is obviously like a kind of a real strength if one can find it in being religious. And it may not be a necessary connection, but if you can truly find the faith to believe that you will inherit eternal life, that's gotta, like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I think that would make me really like kind of impervious, and that actually I would immediately just switch back to caring about all the things I care about at the moment. But it certainly seems like that would have a big effect. I mean, it's interesting on this point. Something you've written quite extensively about that I'm very interested in. I'm sure many others will be in as well. Is universalism in Christianity, which is sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, which is the idea that ultimately all things will be reconciled with God. What is Christian universalism, and what are the kind of reasons internal to Christianity to believe in it?
Well, universalism is the idea that, Christianity traditionally says that there's hell and there's heaven, and that people who are Christian go to heaven and people who aren't go to hell. Universalism is the belief that ultimately everyone that exists will be saved in some form. So there's a very strong form of universalism that says just when you die, everybody's saved, which I think is very rare. And it's hard to make any pragmatic argument for that, because why wouldn't you just do whatever you like? There's another argument that slightly recast the notion of hell as more kind of purgatorial, and argues that ultimately, in the end of the end, all things will be kind of drawn back into God. So you find this in somebody like Origen. You find it to some degree in somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, a text called On the Soul and Resurrection, where he kind of has this dialogue with his sister who's dying that's kind of like riffing on Plato's Phaedo, and he's sort of arguing about the soul. And he kind of argues for this idea that, that there's the process of kind of after you die, that it's kind of like the soul is like separated from the evil that's in it in order to sort of be drawn back to God.
Mm.
And so that if you believe that there's this kind of intrinsic part of God that's within everybody, you find this to some degree in somebody like Julian of Norwich as well, though she doesn't quite acknowledge it in the same way. That, like, if everything that is created is identified with God in some way, then it will kind of be drawn back into God. There's a lot of difficulties with the argument, although I think there's more difficulties with arguing for eternal conscious torment, which would be a kind of quite traditionally held view. Partly you'd argue that it's more widely held in the early church than some people argue. I think you would argue that eternal hell is morally abhorrent, and you would argue that that's not in line with a lot of things that the Bible seems to say about God's nature. But it's certainly not a widely held view, and the immediate response from any Christian would be that it's pragmatically dubious, because why bother with the gospel, or why bother, getting people to become Christians if everyone's going to be saved in the end? So I think any notion of universalism that you hold has to be a kind of, a hope that still sees what you call the Christian gospel as the kind of currency of salvation, that you still believe that the language of hell in the New Testament, or the language of judgment in the New Testament, is serious.
And does that often manifest as this kind of hell as purgatory kind of thing, where hell is kind of a long time but not forever?
Yes. I mean, there's not really any universalist churches, so it's not like people are preaching that they're the kind of, this is what hell is like. So you kind of have to piece it together from the language of certain early church writers. And they're not really talking about hell directly. They're kind of talking more about the notion that so Origen speculates about kind of even the devil and the kind of demons being saved, because there's this inevitable path sort of to kind of like reconciliation. I mean, my argument would be an argument more from one of the defenses of hell that you will get is free will. That, like, I choose to reject God. So somebody like C.S. Lewis kind of popularized this view of hell, that hell is full of people who, the cliche is that hell is a door locked from the inside, and that he just imagined hell as this grey place where people have just chosen to reject God. And I think that the question you would ask is, if God is the end of everyone's desire, which is what C.S. Lewis also argues, like one of his kind of, I think one of his best arguments is this argument from desire, that like God is the end of everything that we desire. So at the end of the last Narnia book, he's got this bit where they all arrive in this kind of like copy of Narnia, and it's like they cast it as almost like Plato's, emerging from the cave, and it's like the kind of it's thing that you really desire that's in everything that exists. But the question is, if that's the case, why would anybody reject it if they had truly free will? And the only answer is that God made them with a nature that's inherently bad, that they would inherently reject God. And I don't think that makes any sense. And then, take the Calvinist position that, well, some Calvinists would argue for kind of dual causation, but Calvinists would emphasize a much more, God is totally sovereign. He just chooses who the elect are. I think if you take that other extreme, you have a kind of abhorrent God that basically just saves a handful of people to glorify himself. And so I think that if you see free will as much more contingent, and if you argue that God, as it says in the New Testament, wills that everybody be saved, it's hard to argue for the conclusion that people are going to hell for eternity, because it doesn't make sense under either of those two kind of arguments.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's because I find kind of soteriological views in Christianity just incredibly fascinating. Partly because it seems like a friend described this once to me as the trouble with soteriology in Christianity is that there is no there's no good answer, there's no flawless answer, because it seems like Christ talks about hell in the New Testament, at least to some degree, although maybe probably not quite as we understand it. So that raises troubles for universalism. At the same time, eternal conscious torment just seems like insane for a God who is meant to be love. Also, there's the question of one of my favorite arguments against eternal conscious torment is the idea that how would I be happy knowing that my friend is in hell? How could somebody in heaven be happy and good knowing that their friend is in hell and nonetheless being in bliss? There might be a kind of necessary condition argument there against eternal conscious torment. And then of course there's annihilationism, the idea that the non-saved are annihilated, which seems to bring its own host of problems. Is it just that each of these positions just has flaws and you just kind of have to pick the one with the least flaws?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. I mean, I would argue that eternal conscious torment is probably the worst flaw, because you don't end up with a good God. But I think, I don't think, I grew up in an environment where belief in hell for eternity was the doctrinal view. I think it's hard to argue that people act like they really believe that. There's a degree to which they act with a kind of, we need people to come into Christianity. It's good to evangelize. It's good to try and be a witness to people in your work or whatever. But it's more of a kind of Christianity is good and people need it. It's hard to really argue that everyone that I know is acting like everyone that they encounter in the street is going to spend eternity suffering in torment unless they do everything within their power to convert them to Christianity. Now, maybe you could say that they might just acknowledge that they're a bit too weak in their actions, but you sort of suggest that you can't. It's really hard to actually internalize that belief, And for much of the history of Christianity, it's probably easier to have that because everyone's a Christian, so it's kind of like Christendom, and it's easy to believe that that whoever you cast as the barbarians are going to hell to eternity. But when we live in a secular world where almost everyone that you're going to encounter is likely not a Christian, can you really sustain the belief that they are all going to hell, even the nice old lady that lives next door to you, because they don't believe? And it's like, which you act like is true.
Yeah, no, it is. It's one of my friends who's a Catholic he's currently kind of in a relationship with a non-Catholic, and I occasionally bring this up to him. I'm like, are you not terrified? I would just be completely terrified if I thought that the kind of person that I loved was destined for hell. I would just be so panicked all the time. Do we, or do people act like eternal conscious torment is genuinely coming to non-believers? I suppose maybe the lovely people that knock on my door sometimes do. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I really like it when religious people knock on my door and try to convert me, because I always think it's nice. They're kind of taking the time out of their day to save the soul of somebody that they don't know, and I have no reason to do this. It's very nice of them.
I remember when I must have been about 18, and I got a younger brother, and I came home one day and I walked into the lounge and he was sitting in the lounge with two Jehovah's Witnesses, and they all had their Bibles open because they'd obviously knocked on the door, and he just invited them in to sit and talk. I think they were arguing about the John 1 or whatever it is.
Yes, yeah. And then if somebody was looking, because I think, Christian universalism is one of those positions where I think people may have come across it but don't necessarily know where to start. Is there a good place to kind of begin reading on Christian universalism?
Well, David Bentley Hart wrote quite a good book a few years ago called That All Shall Be Saved, which is quite a good introduction. I'd probably recommend that. It's fairly readable. So yeah, there aren't that many good popular arguments for it at the moment. So yeah, you can read my Substack.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yes, yeah, and of course your Substack is "This Isle is Full of Noises," which is in addition to being a wonderful Substack, is a lovely monologue from The Tempest.
Although I've been doing it for years and nobody has yet pointed out that the correct quote is "The isle is full of noises."
Is it? See, I think because I've clearly gone back and just corrected them. Because was it Is it
Yeah.
be not afeared? The isle is full of noises.
Yeah.
Ah, that's just Shakespeare, man. It's very good. But yeah, no, I've clearly gone back and like retrospectively corrected my old memory of The Tempest to incorporate
Yeah.
your Substack title. And yeah, and that's where people can find you. And I highly recommend it. It's like one of three Substacks that I'm a paid subscriber to. So it's good. I'm voting with my feet.
Oh, thanks, man.
And just one last thing, which I ask people at the end of every interview. What was the greatest idea that you came across in the past year, and why?
Yeah, you're taking me off guard there. I suppose it's an interesting question about how many ideas really kind of like. I read a book called Behave by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, uh, which he's kind of making this argument for sort of like radical determinism from the perspective of neuroscience. It's interesting, actually. You might compare that to Tom Holland's book. That he's kind of arguing that he sort of takes the kind of moment that you make a particular decision, and he's arguing that he goes back and says it's caused by the kind of hormones, the neurons, your environment, your circumstance. And interestingly, he wrote a subsequent book where he argued that there's no such thing as free will. So he's kind of arguing that every decision that you make is causally determined by the kind of structure of your brain and so on, which interestingly has a kind of interesting analogy to Tom Holland's kind of historical cause argument that everything that you do is causally determined. But it is one of those books it's very well written such that you just don't stop thinking about it, because there's a lot of interesting questions about free will, consciousness. Interestingly, he never mentions consciousness. But you kind of it's one of those things where you can't think your own thoughts as being not caused by something that you're intending to think. Maybe if you meditate for ages, you can. But it's one of those things that's so circular that you can't get around. And I don't have any answers to it, but it's just one of those things that makes you kind of think a lot about it.
Yes, I mean it'd be interesting to tie that together with the point about universalism. In the like, if our decisions are so conditioned, then eternal conscious torment and annihilationism become even more difficult to reconcile, because if we are such products of our environments, then it seems like a just God will give you a lot of chances at the very least.
Yes, and if we are entirely the product, if your thoughts are entirely the product of material causes in the brain, how are you making real reference to an object over there? Is that just patterns of causation that's just picking up on other patterns, or is there really a book over there that's called a book, and I'm really referencing it, and you're really understanding that I'm referencing it? It's a kind of interesting how far you go in that argument.
Yes,
But
that's
an entire another discussion that we can.
But that's and Robert Sapolsky is a very interesting writer. So yeah, I will leave a link to Matt's Substack in the description. Everyone should go check it out. Matt Whiteley, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.